Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Budget Dance. We're so pleased that you could join Juan for this presentation today, and we're very excited to hear from Susan Cundiff and from our own Kathy Robinson. My name is Udzi Vokiwa. I am the Senior Program Associate at WAND, and I will be running the technology today. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. All attendees will be muted during the presentation. If you have any questions for our presenters, please submit them by typing them into the question section of your panel on the right-hand side of your screen, and I'll ask those questions aloud to the presenters during a couple breaks during the presentation. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact GoToWebinar support directly. Their phone number is 1-800-263-6317. And now that that's out of the way, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about our presenters and then turn it over to them for the webinar. So first we'll be hearing from Kathy Crandall Robinson. She's the Senior Public Policy Director here at WAND, and her role is to lead our policy and advocacy strategy. Kathy has a very long history working on nuclear weapons issues and the budget process. She's definitely a good go-to person on this issue, so we appreciate her taking the time to let us know what's going on in Congress with the budget right now. We are also going to be hearing from Susan Cundiff from Eugene, Oregon. Susan Cundiff is the chair of Oregon WAND and also the secretary of the WAND Inc. National Board. Susan spent 34 years in public education as a school counselor, and she brings a great passion and a lot of great knowledge about the budget to the webinar. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kathy Robinson. Kathy?
Thank you, Udzi, and welcome everybody. So today we're going to try to divide this into sort of three sections. First, we're going to talk a little bit about the overall budget, and WAND has traditionally made these budget pies, and we're going to talk about how the budget pie is sliced briefly. And then we'll give you an opportunity for a few questions, and then we will see a really exciting presentation from Susan about how to really talk about the budget with real people. I don't deal with a lot of real people, a lot of folks in Washington, and so so we're glad to have Susan that can talk to us about what she's done to really make the budget more understandable to people and help them understand how they can impact it too. And then we're going to, and we'll have questions for Susan, then we're going to end with just a little bit about what's going on with the budget process right now and what the next steps are in Washington as it gets to be kind of busy season. And Udzi gave us some introductions already, but here is Susan, and you can read her bio when we send this out. And there's me. And we're going to start with serving up the budget pie. This is the overall federal budget, the whole picture. So you can see the A is the discretionary spending, B, interest on the debt, and C, the so-called mandatory spending. And I just wanted to go over a few things about these terms that everybody uses. First of all, what is mandatory spending? That is really where we have programs that are earned benefit programs like Medicare and Social Security. You often hear folks refer to this as entitlement, but I think earned benefit is a much more accurate term. A lot of these are programs that aren't voted on each year by Congress. They don't get to make a decision because once they're kind of set in motion, they do have some we pay the pension every year, we pay the Social Security every year. But I do think that it's important to realize that mandatory does not mean that it's automatic and immutable and never changes. We have policy bills that change things. So for instance, of course, all of the legislation around the Affordable Care Act changed a lot of our health policy and spending, and in this category, as well as our Medicare and so forth. Every year in the defense area, we see a defense authorization bill come out, and that really affects this budget category too. So there are laws that change the mandatory spending, and some of us wish that some of it was considered by Congress really more mandatory, and that they wouldn't think of messing with Social Security and so forth to the degree that they do. On the other hand, people, when you hear discretionary, sometimes think, that's optional, that's like dessert or the extra dress or your shoes or something like that. And in fact, discretionary is all of those programs that keep the government going. Just everything that you can think of, from roads and bridges to education funding, health funding, environment, energy, so on and so forth. And of course, this is the area where Congress gets to do its job every year, and has been relatively unsuccessful in the last year. I think you probably remember the government shutdown in October of last year. So that was when Congress didn't do its job in getting these discretionary spending programs paid for. So this is the discretionary budget. And I'm going through these very quickly, but you'll have these slides, and we can go over them a little bit more in detail. I'm going to look at some of the pie ingredients here, and we're going to start with Pentagon spending. The major part of the Pentagon spending slice, but not the only thing, is the so-called base budget. This is the Department of Defense, and that is an overall amount of about $500 billion. And here are some of the main categories that I've listed: personnel, operations and maintenance, procurement, and R&D. And individually, you look at these, and these are really big portions of our budget. And I'm always struck when I'm looking at this and thinking, this is the Defense Department is the one agency that cannot conduct an audit. So this is huge amounts of money. There's also another item which we've talked a lot about, and some of our colleague organizations have as well, and this is getting to be really very much an issue in Congress, and that is the War Spending Slush Fund, or what's called the Overseas Contingency Operations Fund. And this year that's set as a placeholder amount by the administration of about $80 billion. And so that's, quite a chunk of money. And the other thing to understand about the Overseas Contingency Operation, which I think is significant, is that this is the amount of money which is not coming within the budget caps that were agreed to. So there's a lot of flexibility here, and there's a lot of concern that the Pentagon has, in fact, been using this as a slush fund. In other words, not using it for things that are directly related to war spending, but to things that would otherwise be in its base budget. I wanted to mention the Opportunity Growth and Security Initiative. There is $28 billion for this in the overall defense budget function, and then there's another $28 billion on the other side. And this is from the administration. They wanted to put forth a little bit more than what Congress had agreed to when they set some budget caps at the end of last year. But oftentimes when thinking about it, Congress is probably not going to go above those budget caps that they set themselves. So people think of this money as kind of out there and very unclear whether it will be spent and how it will be spent. Another key ingredient of the Pentagon budget function, which in Washington we call it the 050 function. If you can't give something an acronym, just give it a number. That's what we do in Washington. Is our nuclear weapons funding, and this is really sort of care and feeding for the nuclear warheads that happens at the Department of Energy's National Nuclear Security Administration. It also includes our proliferation or terrorism prevention programs for nuclear weapons, and it also includes the cleanup of the legacy waste from production and testing of nuclear weapons. There's some other funding within this pie slice, and that is for the FBI and some other related things. One of my colleagues used to call this couch change, but I would note that that amount of money is enough to fund several other agencies. What is not in this particular pie slice, and maybe I should just go back. If I can. Sorry. Is not the money for veterans. So in the C slice here, and also not money in international foreign affairs. And I did want to note that there's one piece of the foreign affairs budget. Sorry, I'm getting lost here. There is one ingredient in the foreign affairs budget that often people put logically in the Pentagon spending slice. That's called the international security assistance that you think of as foreign military aid. And that's about $12 billion. And if you do shift that back into the Pentagon spending, then the Pentagon percentage that we spend on Pentagon spending goes up to 55%, whereas foreign affairs drops to 3%. And I believe this is the way National Priorities Project has their pie sliced, and that's a perfectly great way to do it. The only reason that we do not do it that way historically is that we keep these by the budget functions, those little numbers that I was talking about. So going to foreign affairs, just to note some of the other ingredients that are in that relatively tiny slice of pie is humanitarian assistance and development and the conduct of foreign affairs at the State Department and embassies. And I would note that that money, that $15 billion, and then if you even add on $1.4 billion on foreign information and exchange activities, that's more money, or that's less money than we spend on nuclear weapons. So you can think about what you think is worth it. And I did skip over some slides, and I'm going to just continue forward because I am running out of time. But there's a couple slides in there that go more into depth about some of the details of the Pentagon spending, including the nuclear weapons spending. In terms of the domestic spending that's in the discretionary budget, I think it's important to realize that about 1/3 of the spending flows directly to the states. So when you're thinking about budgeting impacts, when you cut this budget, it doesn't just affect the immediate, it also affects all those state budgets. So for instance, if a big portion of your state budget is state payments on education, but you get your federal contribution cut dramatically, then that probably means that you're going to have to either raise taxes in your state or cut education. Together with foreign affairs spending, that 4% or 3%, depending on how you calculate it, piece of the pie, and this domestic discretionary spending, all of this, which is kind of left over from that pie, is often called non-defense discretionary spending, which is a long, convoluted title, and I think conveys that it's non-defense, it's discretionary, it's not that important. That's like everything. It's education, roads, rails, bridges, disaster relief, food safety, national parks, child nutrition programs, and on and on and on. And as I did note when we were talking about the Pentagon spending slice of the pie, there's the administration in its budget request included about $28 billion for the Opportunity, Growth, and Security Initiative. So we've got that on both sides of the defense spending, so-called, and the non-defense spending. So I'm going to stop here and let you all answer some questions, and I'm going to turn it back over to Udzi to help with that process.
Thank you, Kathy. Just want to remind everyone how to submit questions. You should see a question box on your attendee panel, and when you type your questions in there, they'll come to me, and I'll ask them to Kathy out loud. So I'll get started while people are thinking about their questions. The first question is from Janet Weil. Janet asks, how much of the interest on the debt is due to war spending?
That's a great question, and I have to say I don't know that off the top of my head. I do feel like there are other people who've done some work on that, and maybe the cost of war and the National Priorities Project might have some more information. But it's such a great question. I want to know the answer too, so I will try to find out.
Thanks, Kathy. Janet is also wondering if the FBI and other section of the budget pie also includes the NSA and CIA, and also where nuclear weapons spending is housed in the budget.
Nuclear weapons spending is within, starting with the easier part first, I guess. The nuclear weapons spending is part of that overall budget function that we call 050, and so it's considered defense spending. But it is those activities, those nuclear weapons, and it's really nuclear warhead activities and the nuclear weapons complex, all of that happens at the Department of Energy's National Nuclear Security Administration. And when you go through the appropriation process that we're going to talk a little bit about later, that piece is considered within what's called the energy and water development part of the appropriations subcommittee. So nuclear weapons is there in terms of the budget, but the process for it is a little bit different than how it's dealt with for the Pentagon. And the other things are within the budget. I think where exactly all of those things are is not clear. I would say also that there are a lot of homeland security activities which are in different parts of the budget, not within the standard defense budget.
All right, thank you, Kathy. That's all the questions we have for now. So I guess now we'll turn it over to Susan Cundiff. Susan?
Thank you, Udzi. I want to begin by talking just a minute or two about the value of budget demonstrations. I first saw the budget pie demonstration in 2002 when Bobby Wren Banks came to Oregon, and it was actually the first program that I ever went to of WAND here. My career was 30 years in education, during which time we experienced multiple cuts to education budgets. And frequently, public employees and their huge salaries and their enormous budget benefit packages, as they were depicted in the news and by people who were talking about those cuts, we were often vilified. So when I saw the discretionary budget pie that Bobby Wren displayed, I was stunned to compare the Pentagon budget, the size of that budget, to the education budget. And when I realized that that education budget covered elementary, secondary, college, and preschool, all of those aspects for all of the states and the federal support, I finally began to understand the size of the Pentagon budget. And so Oregon WAND has looked for various ways to depict that budget in interactive form. And one of the ways you see on the screen right now, it is a converting the pie graph to a bar graph in a sequential fashion. And just thinking of the 55 or 54% of the Pentagon budget, if you were to give a foot to each percentage point and then compare that to the percentage point for food and agriculture, you would be looking at 55 feet for the Pentagon and 1 foot for food and agriculture. There's something very dramatic about those long bars. And Oregon Wand has worked with the budget in interactive ways. We have shown it as a feltboard pie graph on our information tables when we're at events. And most recently have done this paper rollout. If you could go to the next slide, you will see that I made 5 of these bar graphs and was able to share one with Arkansas Wand. And so there you see the entire bar graph rolled out, and you can see that it is almost as wide as the steps to the Capitol. They showed that on tax day there. And Georgia Wand also has a copy, and they'll be using it at an event on Thursday, I believe, called Move the Money. If you could show the next slide. It is I had an idea about entering the Code Pink and National Priorities contest to create an image that depicted the trade-offs that we experience, and I focused on the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter aircraft and compared that to those cuts in SNAP. And so that was a great deal of fun to create, and I had the help from our local Wand nerd to create the image. If you could show the next slide. It shows another way that we have used the budget as a bar graph, and we laid it out on a walk that was done for Million Mom March here in Eugene. So the first 50, this was in '07. You can see that the Pentagon budget has grown since then. And so the first 53% of that walk was devoted to the Pentagon. And we had signs along the way, and as people were just over halfway to their end point, they saw that they had completed the Pentagon budget. And the next slide will show you that the following portions of that walk were much shorter. And the slide after that shows that we also have done it using Ben & Jerry, or the True Majority Oreo cookie display. So we've looked for lots of ways, and most recently we're doing it with this budget bar graph paper rollout. The very act of rolling it out as that red stripe just keeps on rolling for the Pentagon carries a lot of drama. And we're finding that this is memorable and a great deal of fun to present it to groups. It makes us better able to discuss with others, I think, if it becomes part of our memory bank as an image as well as talking points. So we created a kind of slapdash video that we posted on YouTube of rolling out this budget banner for the script. I based the banner on National Priorities Project figures, and for the script, I used the wording from Rethink Media as often as I could. So we can take a look at this video. It's about 4 minutes. I wish I had removed the rubber bands from my braces before we did the video, because it gives me kind of a fiendish look with fangs. But if you can get past that, we'll take a look at how this presentation works.
April is tax season. We thought you might like to take a look at how your tax dollars are spent. Since Congress spends so much time in conflict over spending, it's only fair that we get a chance to express our ideas about the way our money is apportioned. Let's roll out the federal budget and take a look at President Obama's proposal for 2015. This is the discretionary portion of the budget. That's about 1/3 of the budget. We're going to talk about it because it's the part that Congress debates and has control over. Therefore, we have a say in it too. So, $5.8 billion per inch, and this part is the Pentagon. You can keep on rolling that. I'll be able to go that way, yes. And geez, this just keeps on rolling. And finally, we have a new color. You can let it keep going. This is the education portion. It is 6%. The Pentagon is 55% of the discretionary budget. And government is also 6%. That includes law enforcement and funding commerce. Next comes vets benefits, health care, housing, income, and housing and community. That's community funds, health, unemployment, labor, international affairs, not weaponry, but for assistance in energy, environment, science, transportation, and food at 1%. With the Pentagon taking up more than half of this budget, we have to ask ourselves what we're getting with our tax dollars. Does this huge sum of money make our country safer and stronger? Pentagon spending has nearly doubled over the last decade. In contrast, remaining discretionary funding in these categories, ranging from food safety to Head Start, health care, environmental protection, rebuilding bridges, and much more, has been cut. Finding responsible and strategic cost savings must be a priority for the Pentagon. Some examples of things to cut would be the oversized nuclear budget, nuclear arsenal, and the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, which has grown 75% in 13 years, and the plane doesn't even work. Or we could rein in the Pentagon slush fund. As we are ending the war in Afghanistan, stop using the war spending account as a slush fund that is not subject to budget caps. We can make these changes without negatively impacting our troops. In fact, by investing some of the billions we spend on Pentagon waste in other sectors of our economy, we would generate more jobs, as economists at the University of Massachusetts Amherst found. And that would mean a brighter future for our returning troops and for all of us. Move the money.
Well, there you have it. And if you could show the next slide, Udzi. It is back to a collection of those photos that show the banner when it's rolled out. The slipovers, those yellow layovers, are really helpful to describe in a brief way and depict in a brief way the impact of the various portions of the Pentagon budget. And I actually added that military personnel portion after we had created the video. It was because one of the women who watched the presentation has a daughter in the Air Force, and she had been looking at Pentagon spending, and her point was there are portions of that budget that are worthwhile. And I agreed with her wholeheartedly that we are not talking about reducing our commitment to our veterans. And so I added that. That's the personnel portion of the military budget. It's also very helpful, of course, to look at how much is devoted to some of the programs, like the nuclear weapons portion and the F-35, or the overseas contingency portion, as Kathy pointed out, with $80 billion as a placeholder. And then you can also demonstrate the size of those weapons programs compared to other portions of the budget bar graph down in that colorful end of the portions. And certainly the nukes and F-35 portion is greater than food and agriculture or international affairs, the diplomatic aspect of international affairs, which is what's depicted in this portion. You know, I think my time's about up, and we have time for questions now. There are just a few aspects of this that I'll mention quickly. One is that when I lay it out, I try with great diligence to be very accurate. Of course, if you're off by just a quarter of an inch, it means that you're talking about a couple $1 billion. And so as I roll it out, I often say that the graph is accurate to within, $1 billion or two. Also, the veterans benefits, which has grown, allows an opportunity to talk about the impact of citizen outrage when our veterans were coming back so injured and damaged from the Iraq War. And we didn't have proper facilities in the veterans hospitals. So that portion being separated out, although it is also a cost of war, is one that we can support as our commitment to veterans. And the other thing I'll mention is that this is really a bipartisan issue. The federal budget has looked like this for decades as far as proportions, and there's not much difference under Republican or Democrat leadership in the White House. That this disproportion continues to exist in all of those, as we know from the military-industrial congressional complex. And that's really what we're trying to combat with our efforts at raising awareness and giving people ways to talk about the federal budget. So I'm ready for any questions if any of you have some.
Thank you so much, Susan. That was really, really powerful and enlightening. We do have a few questions for you. Our first question is from Kim Weichel, and I'm not sure if maybe Kathy might want to weigh in on this question as well. The question is, now that the wars are winding down and defense spending has been cut back somewhat, will that affect the percentage of money going to other sectors? or given the deficit, are all sectors being cut back proportionally?
Well, the OCO, that Overseas Contingency Operations budget, is where the war spending supposedly is. And as we look at that budget, even though our troops have been cut by half in the past year, the size of that budget placeholder has gone up. And we also know that that portion of the budget is not subjected to caps. And so your question of, is that being cut? We aren't seeing the cuts in the Pentagon budget. That's the frustration, and that's the phrase of bring the war money home. The cuts under sequestration and those caps were set supposedly to occur in both portions of the budget, but we're finding that the Pentagon has found ways to avoid them. We're not finding ways to avoid them in the other portions of the budget, and that's part of the struggle.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I agree with everything Susan said completely, and I would just note that there has been, as we've gone through these, fiscal cliffs, crises, berms, whatever you call them, over the last, there's been, a lot of attention paid to, oh, the Pentagon budget is being cut dramatically, and the reality is that it hasn't been. Not only do we still have this war spending account, even though we're bringing all these troops home, but the overall base budget has stayed very high, especially if you look at the forecasted plans in the future years. So even if we come sort of hold steady and have some pressure on the Pentagon budget now, we see it going up in the so-called out years. So and this is definitely impacting. It's definitely a zero-sum game at the moment with the concerns about the budget. And so all of these other areas of our federal budget are really being affected: education, health, all of that.
Thank you, Susan and Kathy. Our next question is from Sally Smith. And Sally asks, and this question's for Susan. Susan, if you could talk about the kind of response you got from the events where you've posted, where you've used the budget banner, and how you're leveraging that in working with your members of Congress.
Well, in the events where we've displayed it, I've been struck by the attention given by the audience and questions that arise from it. And in fact, there have been two pieces of writing that that I've seen, that I've gotten through email. One is a copy of a letter to our county commissioners, and another was in an op-ed published in our local paper, where the writers, who I know had seen the demonstration, were referring to the budget, the federal discretionary budget, and the way in which they did it, they were borrowing language that we had used. So I felt certain that that was part of the impact. As far as leveraging it with our congressional reps, we have not gone that step yet. We did collect postcards at our tax day event asking for reining in that OCO budget. And when we deliver those collections of postcards, we will talk about the budget and this demonstration and the ways in which people have indicated it influenced them.
Thank you very much, Susan. We do have a few more questions, but I want to make sure we have time for Kathy to walk us through the budget process. So I'm going to turn it over to Kathy, and then we'll have a little bit more time for questions at the end. Kathy?
Okay, thank you. Yes, I'll go through the next part of this very quickly so that we can get to questions for Susan. So this lovely chart was put together by the National Priorities Project, and I do love it, but it also can be a little daunting. And don't worry, you don't have to memorize this or really, study it in depth. But I did want to point out sort of where we are. And the administration has submitted its budget. That's the source for the budget pie information that we were looking at the beginning. It's really the federal budget request, and those are all the blue and the little gold bar up here. We've also gone through sort of the budget resolution process, such as it is going to be this year, and the reason why it was a little different than it might otherwise be is because at the end of last year, after the government shut down and all that, there was an agreement to set some budget caps, and really the House and the Senate are going to be going by those numbers. The House, as you recall, Mr. Ryan felt obligated to come up with his own budget, and that is useful and interesting to look at. It certainly sets the picture, the blueprint, if you will, for how the Republicans would like to move the budget forward. And I recommend the National Priorities Project information about the Ryan budget versus the President's budget and versus the Congressional Progressive Caucus proposed budget. So now what's happening is the beginning of the appropriations process, and there have been a number of hearings already, and markups are going to be starting. That's the process that a subcommittee or committee goes through in considering a bill before it goes to the floor. There's an appropriations committee in both the House and the Senate, and there are 12 subcommittees that deal with all of the different issues, all of those different pieces of the discretionary budget pie. And this is going back to, I think it was Janet who asked the question about nuclear weapons. So the overall Pentagon spending, all of the Defense Department and the war spending are considered within the defense appropriations. Nuclear weapons, even though it's part of the budget function of defense, is part of the Energy and Water Development Appropriations Subcommittee. There are other appropriations committees that consider other pieces of the pie. There's this subcommittee for Foreign Affairs, which is the State Department and Foreign Operations, which we also follow, and all the other different areas of the budget. So that's just beginning now. And the other aspect, which is kind of important to us as we work on trying to reduce the amount of Pentagon spending, is the Defense Authorization Act. Now, not everybody, not all of the different appropriations measures have a parallel sort of authorization process, but that has been the history in the defense area. So we kind of get two bites at the apple to talk about defense spending. And next slide. So those opportunities are coming up fairly quickly in May. The House Armed Services Committee, which is the committee that considers the National Defense Authorization Act, will be gathering in their committee to mark up the NDAA, as we call it, in the House on May 7th. And then the whole House will consider that the week of May 19th. This is what's scheduled. Things change, but this is what we think so far. And then the House is also planning to work on its defense appropriations bill the week of May 19th in the committee, and then it will possibly go to the floor the week of June 9th. In the Senate, it's always much harder to predict the schedule, but we are anticipating that the NDAA in the Senate, the Armed Services Committee, will begin considering that the week of May 19th. When it will ever get to the Senate floor is a deeper mystery. And I will say that the House Armed Services Committee markup is a very open process. It's on C-SPAN. It's on C-SPAN often until the very wee hours of the morning they stay, and some of the most interesting parts to me are the nuclear weapons and nonproliferation, and those tend to be towards the end, so I'm often up at 4 o'clock in the morning with my popcorn watching this. And on the Senate side, despite efforts that some of us have been making, it's much more closed and much more opaque process. But nevertheless, these provide some opportunities for us to take some action and influence the process by calling on our members of Congress. So one of the ways that we want to help you do that is with another opportunity to engage the debate with letters to the editor. And I know that Susan mentioned great talking points from Rethink Media. They also are going to help us on our next webinar to think about writing effective letters to the editor. And it's well timed on May 14th. It'll be before we see some of these things like the defense authorization bill debated on the House floor. And so we hope you will join us for that. We also hope you will join WAND, and we will be putting out action alerts and updated information about the defense authorization, the defense appropriation, and other opportunities as they come up. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Udzi and let you ask questions to Susan or I.
Thank you very much, Kathy. As I said, we did have a number of questions. So our next question is from Jesse Stevens. Jesse asks, how do we engage young people on these issues? How do we empower them to know more about the status of the nation so that they can take action? And how do we let them know about how money is allocated in Congress?
Is that question for me?
I think it's for either of you.
Okay. Well, the more visual and the more dramatic, I think, is one way to engage young people. We have found that at various rallies whenever we've been able to do the demonstration. People of all ages are really intrigued by it, and the fact that it doesn't look quite so mathematical as a pie graph, I think the fact that it's moving and rolling makes it more captivating. Kathy, you might have something to add to that.
That's true, and I think that there was part of that about engaging Congress, and I would just say that I think that's a really important aspect. Just having a little bit of information about this sets you apart, because I think a lot of people really have no idea how this how this budget looks and how the process works. And I talk about this budget pie and just sort of take it for granted that everybody knows that, more than half of our budget goes to Pentagon spending every year. It just doesn't occur to me that people don't know that. And I gave a brief presentation to a group of fairly engaged women, civically engaged women who really know a lot about other things. And they gasped because they were just totally shocked to know that this is what our budget priorities are. And so I think, letting your members of Congress know that you understand this and that you want to see a change is a really important aspect. And there are lots of new ways to sort of get that message across in terms of social media and so forth. But one of the better ways we think still is the good old-fashioned letters to the editor. So that's why we're doing that additional webinar in May.
Thank you both. Our next question is from Diane Valentin. And Diane asks, can you break out how much of defense spending is actually spent on the troops and maintaining our armed forces and what's spent on arms in war?
Well, I could go back. Let's see if I can. Well, I'm not going to be able to go back to the right section, but it's in there. You want to look a little bit at the personnel cost part. That would be sort of what we spend on troops. And then also remember that there's a totally separate sort of budget pie that goes to veterans. And then in terms of war spending, you have that additional overseas contingency operations account. And then if you look at other things like procurement of weapons and research and development, that's all going towards sort of weapon systems as opposed to troops. So can kind of look at those broad categories and see, and then of course if you're interested in a particular, like how much the F-35 costs, you can go back and look at those figures. And I think I'll leave it at that, but I will let you look at the slides when I send them out, Diane.
Okay, well, while you're transitioning, I think we'll take another question from Susan Williams. Susan asks, how is sequestration affecting both veterans and the Pentagon budget?
How is sequestration affecting them?
Yes.
That was the question. Sequestration hasn't affected the Pentagon budget much at all. I think I remember they experienced a cut overall of just 1%. And that's partly because of the ability to shift most popular programs that they want to protect into that overseas contingency operations fund. So their reductions have only amounted to 1%, whereas the reductions, the impact of reductions on all of those other portions of the budget have been much greater and more significant. I don't have exact figures for that.
I think that's right, and when you're thinking about veterans specifically, that budget has done overall, I'd say, a little bit better under sequestration than some other things, but keep in mind that our costs for our veterans, our health costs and so forth, have really been going up because of all of the wars and the lasting effects. So I mean, politically, I think that's a hard place to cut, which is a good thing. But it's also something that overall, in the broader scheme of how our budget priorities are made and our budget pie is sliced, there's still too much pressure on veterans. And really that should not be something that we are, nickel and diming at all, ever.
Well said, Kathy. Well, I know we have a few more questions, but we're just about out of time. So I wanted to go ahead and say thank you to Kathy and to Susan for this great presentation, and thank you to everyone who joined the webinar at home. Please be on the lookout for some follow-up materials. We'll be sending you an email with a link to the recording from this presentation, and also with information about our next webinar, which is coming up, as Kathy mentioned, May 14th at 2 p.m. That is a Wednesday. And also, there will be a survey that will appear on your screen after the webinar ends. And if you could please give us your feedback so that we continue to improve our webinar program, we would really appreciate that. Again, thank you so much to everyone, and we're going to end there.